I blame this on midterms. But luckily you all are here. And it should be great. Well, first I would like to thank everyone for coming. It's a real pleasure to have you all here. I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce Director Nmezi. Ms. Ngozi Nmezi was appointed Executive Director of the Office on African Affairs in May 2011. Nmezi, a Nigerian-American, was born and raised in Washington, D.C. by foreign-born Nigerian parents. She has first-hand experience of the challenges that African immigrants and their children face when navigating the process of acculturation and is sensitive to the issues that arise from these challenges. Additionally, having lived, worked, and attended school in Nigeria for 3 consecutive years, Ms. Nmezi developed an insightful understanding of diverse ethnic African constituencies. Her experiences abroad and in Washington, D.C. enable her to see the needs of African immigrant communities from a very unique, holistic perspective. Prior to her appointment, Ms. Nmezi served as a risk management specialist for the Department of Real Estate Services. There, she reviewed, analyzed, and interpreted regulations and legislation pertaining to risk and safety management, worked to minimize total costs of risk for the agency, and acted as a liaison between the agency and the Office of Risk Management. Previously, she was a proposal coordinator and partner liaison for the International Development Wing of the Global Support Services firm, ACOM, and a contract coordinator with the Health Services for Children with Special Needs and the HSC Pediatric Center in the District of Columbia. Ms. Nmezi received her bachelor's degree in biology at Howard University, where she conducted botanical research on the medicinal value of plants in Edo State, Nigeria, via the Minority Health International Research Training Program. She received a Master of Public Health degree from Howard University. At Howard, she was a graduate research assistant for the Genetics of Recurrent Early Onset Depression, GenRed, study, sponsored by National Institute of Mental Health. Ms. Nmezi developed her capstone research project around a mental health study targeting African immigrant constituencies in the greater Washington, D.C. area, titled A Transgenerational Study, Acculturation and Depression Amongst African Immigrants. And with that, I would like to get started. Thank you, Dr. Nmezi, very much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So first, just to open up, could you please discuss what the Mayor's Office on African Affairs does and what it seeks to accomplish?
So I just want to first start by thanking the audience, obviously, for coming and really being interested in the topic of how domestic policy and foreign policy kind of intersect and are inextricably linked. And also want to thank the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies for inviting me to speak on that topic. So the D.C. Mayor's Office on African Affairs was actually conceived, I should say, in March 23rd of 2006. We actually just turned 7 this past weekend, and thank you much. But it wasn't up and running until January of 2007. So legislatively, what we're tasked to do is to ensure that a full range of district government services are accessible to D.C.'s African immigrant community. The district's African immigrant community counts to about 16,000 foreign-born residents. And I say that quote unquote because there's always kind of a contentious little battle around how many Africans actually exist, foreign-born Africans actually are residing here in the District of Columbia. And the foreign-born African constituency can be seen and concentrated in specific wards such as Ward 1, Ward 4, and Ward 6. So that's also important to note. And how we're able to kind of attain our mission is by really organizing and facilitating educational programming around the mayor's priorities and the community's priorities. So health, education, economic development and business, public safety, as well as social services. And we also aim to really just improve the quality of life of African immigrants, support community development by supporting the African business community, as well as the nonprofits that serve our most vulnerable constituents. And lastly, increase civic engagement and public participation of the African immigrant community in District of Columbia affairs.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you for that overview. So there are a great deal of issues facing African communities in DC, which I would love for you to speak on, but with particular emphasis on economics and education, as you've mentioned. In your opinion, what issues are most pertinent and why? And what are the barriers, both cultural and administrative, to engaging African immigrant communities?
Mm-hmm. Sorry, two-part question there.
Two-part.
I would say that it's really difficult to actually ascertain what would be more important than the other in terms of just specific sector issues. Because if you're thinking holistically about how things affect one another, you always kind of see how they're really inextricably linked. So if you're talking about or looking at it from the economics kind of standpoint or context, for instance, jobs and economic development or jobs and workforce development, you can see that within the African immigrant community, there are issues specifically around underemployment. Right, because what's happening is there are African immigrants that will come over from their countries of origins. They've maybe earned all of these accolades and advanced degrees back home, whether it be in Ethiopia or in Nigeria or in Ghana. And what happens is they migrate over. Maybe they're economic refugees or there's some kind of adverse situation that's happened on the continent that have made them migrate over. And what we have is really kind of a brain drain from the continent and then the brain waste when they actually get to the country that their end goal or end destination country. So what we're finding is a lot of our community members have advanced degrees. I think they're really kind of different when you look at the African immigrant community in likelihood or looking at it vis-a-vis other immigrant communities here in the District of Columbia. For instance, they are newer. The African immigrant community is the newest community. More than half of the 1.5 million African immigrants that reside in the United States of America arrived after 2000. Youngest, in that they're most likely to be within the ages of 18 and 64, so more likely to be within working age. Fastest growing in the DC metropolitan area. There have been projections that they're kind of increasing at a rate of about 30% when you're comparing it to other immigrant groups, but also paradoxically kind of more likely to live below the poverty line than other African or other immigrant groups. So you have to really kind of, look at that glaring paradox and kind of understand what some of the issues are. And I've already explained what the answer is. It's around underemployment, unemployment, and really not being able to kind of align the foreign-born degrees or foreign-born expertise with opportunities here. So, of course, the office has a programmatic response to that around our jobs circle and eventually through a high-skilled African immigrant placement program that they're actually interested in kicking off in the very near future. Now, when you kind of take the workforce development piece and you speak to the second piece of what you'd asked for and how they're actually intertwined, I think around the kind of education piece, you can see, again, around the expertise that is earned in the foreign-born countries of origin and brought over and lost, and then also even within district public schools, if you're talking about youth. And I should mention what happened was late or early last year, the Office on African Affairs organized numerous focus groups in DC public schools, and we did it in preparation for the mayor's first ever African Youth Town Hall that was held last April, which gave African youth an opportunity to directly engage the mayor and ask some specific questions and really kind of relay their narrative on what their experiences are in DC public schools. And what we were finding from a lot of city counselors and administrators in schools is that, African immigrant kids are typically pretty high performing, specifically around focus groups that were performed at Brightwood Education Campus up in Ward 1, and also Ward 4 rather, and also the Columbia Heights Education Campus, which is right over on 16th Street in Ward 1. So high performing was definitely a recurring theme, and then also kind of an issue with the kids that they were explaining was around identity. Which I think is the second part of one of the questions. But, really kind of being confused as to how to identify or what buckets they feel that they should identify in or what box to tick. So we kind of saw that as a recurring theme, too. And there was a second part question?
Yes, the second part was what are the barriers, both cultural and administrative, to engaging African immigrant communities?
So the barriers are really, I would say, around language. Obviously, kind of the linguistic barriers are there. We know that on the continent of Africa, there are about 3,000 different languages that are accounted for. I think in Nigeria alone, there are about 521 living languages. So you can imagine that once they migrate, these languages and this language or English proficiency actually migrate with them. So linguistic diversity is definitely a huge kind of barrier in being able to directly touch. There's not one person that can speak but so many different languages. Also, there's just an attitudinal barrier around kind of attitudes and perception of governmental structures and kind of a fear or mistrust in terms of kind of government approaching specific communities. But I think that's really kind of indicative of most all immigrant communities. But I'd say those are the leading ones.
Okay, that's very clear. Now, you did touch on identity briefly, and I just wanted to know if you could elaborate on those issues and the topic overall, and then what solutions or resources you believe to be necessary for making the navigation of American culture less burdensome. And then, of course, specifically, if you'd like to touch on your own personal experiences and how your experiences inform your work now, feel free to do so.
Sure. So I'm actually Nigerian American. I was born right here in Washington, D.C., in Manor Park, Ward 4, which is still a huge concentration of African immigrants up until today. So I went through D.C. public schools for a good number of years of my life. I went to J.G. Whittier Elementary School before kind of relocating to Nigeria and coming back, obviously going to Howard University. So on and off in the District of Columbia for about 30 years. And I think just really kind of around the identity piece, I would say that most folks like myself who are first generation, whose parents immigrated in the early 70s, who are economic refugees, came in search of better opportunity, did kind of experience this kind of identity piece just because we live in a country that wants to kind of impose or put you in a bucket or a box or a check, and it's not a bad thing. It's just the way that the system is. But when you are at home within a specific kind of surrounding where there's specific kind of cultures and regimens and customs that are kind of, shared with you, and these things are very different from what you're exposed to, say, in a school setting, then of course there can be a bit of confusion around how or what you're supposed to identify as. But no one is really born with an identity, at least I believe that. I think it's something that really just kind of you grow into and you evolve into, and then you're constantly defining. So I think it's just important, and I even said it to the youth, that you really kind of own the specific identity that you know that you're forming, and not really be so quick to take the identity that's imposed on you. And then once you form that identity, please be kind of confident in sharing it, because it really adds to the narrative of why we're Americans or what it means to be African in America. So it's always important to kind of embrace those differences. But the identity, I think, is without saying, it's definitely one of the bigger challenges within all immigrant communities, not just the African immigrant community.
Thank you. Well, given that it is Women's Month and women's issues are always a pertinent topic, I wanted to know if you could touch on some issues that you see particularly affecting women immigrants in D.C. And how your office works to ameliorate those issues.
So there are specific issues, and I mean, if you're talking about women, I kind of want to go into health. It's just kind of a natural kind of progression for me. But I think what would stand out the most, I would say, and I can use an example of the African Women's Cancer Awareness Association, which is a community-based organization that we work very closely with, that works around cancer within the African immigrant community, which is a silent killer. So there are women that are suffering from it that may or may not know. There's taboo around kind of sickness, and I think that kind of pervades most communities that make up the American communities. But right now, what we're actually doing, and we've actually even infused the African Women Cancer Awareness Association into our larger initiative, is our health education and outreach initiative that we've just launched in February of 28th last month. And what we're really focusing on doing with that initiative is to kind of a culturally targeted outreach campaign that's going to be available in different languages and is multi-pronged to really address kind of wellness and health gaps within the African immigrant community. Of course, cancer is a topic that we'll definitely infuse into that in our larger health and wellness fair. But just a little bit of kind of background of the programs is that it's multi-pronged, so we're focusing on a social media push, and our theme is Team Africa, to think, eat, act, and move. So kind of always be thinking about ways to access screening, get screening, eating healthier foods, which falls in line with the mayor's initiative around nutrition, acting and really kind of being active and seeking out information and resources to improve your health and your quality of life, and moving really by kind of getting fit and staying healthy via exercise. So the social media push obviously is a campaign around that to make sure that it's culturally appropriate and targeted to the African immigrant community. What happens typically with health campaigns is that because the African immigrant community is not disaggregated from the African American community, kind of on the bicentennial census level, sometimes there are, or most times, there are health campaigns or specific campaigns that are to target African immigrants, but really don't, because they're not kind of branded or marketed to that constituency. So we're very cognizant of that and kind of implementing that within our own health initiative. But one part is a social media push that's finished. The second part is roving workshops around 3 specific topics. So what we've done is we've chosen host partners in the community, 2 community-based organizations, 2 mosques, and 2 churches that have a predominant kind of African American attendance or African immigrant constituency, and we actually want to take workshops around health literacy, nutrition, and mental health to these different venues and share this information with our community members. And all of this will culminate in an actual health and wellness fair on June 1st, which will really just kind of be a resource fair and screening and testing kind of intensive. So being that it's really appropriate that you actually asked me that, because I'm happy that I was able to share that with you. But it's definitely an initiative that targets all of our community members, and most definitely our women, which we find extremely important. So at least that they will be able to have that information and come out to the actual fair and really encourage them to get tested for specific diseases that may affect our community.
Thank you. Now I want to move to more of a foreign policy perspective. And given that there is such a large African immigrant population, one would think that there would be some type of impact on the overall constituency of DC and how politicians and how policymakers view that constituency. Do you find that there is an impact of your office or on those foreign policies?
Yes, definitely. Particularly because I know most all of us are familiar with what's happening, with the State Department in partnership with MPI and the IDEA, the International Diaspora Engagement Alliance, really just been a renewed interest around how the diaspora is contributing to their countries of origin, particularly the African diaspora. In 2010, there's a stat that says that the African diaspora actually contributed $40 billion worth of recorded remittances to their individual countries of origin, second only to foreign direct investment. So this is something that is, I'm always really kind of dubious, because I'm like, okay, this isn't new. We've all known, most of our parents kind of came over, they've been here in the States or wherever they've been in developing countries, they've always kind of sent money home. But I think it's just kind of now gotten onto the radars of most of the policymakers, which is fine. I'm happy that it's happening. But it's something that is long kind of predates this new kind of wave around diaspora engagement, but what I do around community relations and community engagement and outreach is diaspora engagement. It just depends on what lens you look at it through. When we're building coalitions like Team Africa and involving health advocates and African practitioners and African government employees, and we have this kind of active coalition of health advocates, that are interested and already have that topic, this is something that we can present on the federal level of, an African diaspora coalition that you can tap into to make sure they're actually affecting policies on health in their individual countries of origin. Or if we provide technical assistance and outreach education for the African diaspora marketplace. Everybody familiar with that? We actually did work with USAID and MPI and a few other partners to suggest African entrepreneurs that were interested in actually kind of competing for that seed money to, get in there and do startups in their countries of origin. So we kind of support in very different angles. And I should also mention there was a really, really kind of interesting statistic. I was actually on a panel just 2 days ago for LDI Africa, which is this wonderful initiative that's just been kicked off by an Atlas Corps fellow. Atlas Corps is a nonprofit kind of building organization that's right here in D.C. But he had mentioned that there's Jacuna, which is a African entrepreneurship kind of hub, had recently did a survey with African diaspora MBAs that are earning their MBAs in Western, kind of leading Western institutions. And that survey said that 70% of them will go back to the continent after they graduate. 70%. I just thought that was a glaring statistic. And of that 70%, half of them will actually start businesses in their country of origin. So, what's happening here is that the diaspora is just kind of moving around, and there's this movement of kind of going back and addressing kind of the intellectual capital piece and the human resource piece. So I think by really just inadvertently by engaging these folks here in the District of Columbia in different hubs, by ensuring that they're joining specific coalitions based on their interest, by sharing information with them that affects their countries of origins or policy in their country of origin, and soliciting their feedback. We are just kind of actively always involved on the local level and on the federal level, just by virtue of being members of the African diaspora.
Fabulous. Okay, well, at this time, I would really like to give you the chance to cover anything that you haven't spoken on thus far, any projects that you feel are important to highlight. So the floor is yours.
Oh, great. Well, I thought this was a pretty comprehensive kind of interview, so I thank you for that. And I just thought it would be good for me to kind of really just go in a little bit more in depth about kind of the vision of the office, the mission, and a few of the programs that we have, and some of the kind of achievements from each of the programs, so that everyone could have a kind of a good understanding, and at least it could shape your Q&A. So, of course, the vision of our office is basically, the mayor envisions the District of Columbia as a community that thrives on the full engagement of its ethnically, linguistically, and socially diverse residents. So that's the reason why there are all of these kind of ethnic constituency offices housed in the executive office of the mayor. I don't know that a lot of people understand, just from a political standpoint, like how impactful that is. I mean, there are not a lot of other jurisdictions in the country. Particularly, I can even call out New York. They have a larger African immigrant constituency than we do, but we actually have a standing office from a political lens in the executive office of the mayor. So that's just something to note. The larger DMV has about 150,000 African immigrants, and I think New York is at about 200,000, the greater New York metropolitan area. So that's something to note. And we really, in the office, recognize kind of the extraordinary diversity and what it takes to be able to reach specific communities. So we pride ourselves on really implementing targeted outreach strategies, so including kind of home associations, which is important. I don't know how many of you guys have parents who kind of dress up and go to meetings every Sunday. It's like, we don't quite know what they're meeting on, but you know that there are a couple of people that are meeting and they're all together, and it's really just a golden outreach opportunity kind of from a government perspective. So it's very important to really kind of engage those smaller hubs, which is particularly what we focus on, and really being able to drive our mission. So in doing so, we really aim to empower the African community with knowledge and resources by facilitating programmatic activities, doing targeted outreach strategies, and of course, advocacy within government. So it's an understanding that it's a two-way street, right? When we go into those community meetings and we go into specific meetings where our community members are, and we hear complaints, and these complaints are recurring. Or if we sit in our office and we have constituent cases that come in, more than half of our constituent cases are around business, by the way, business development, wanting to start a business, wanting to engage in kind of trade on the continent, wanting to do work here and, be able to be impactful back on the continent. And so this is what our community members are talking about. Then we're able to kind of relay that to the appropriate agency. We're saying, hey, the Department of Small and Local Business Development, this is what's happening within our community. Half of our constituent cases cases are business entrepreneurship or entrepreneurs, potential entrepreneurs. They're interested in starting business. They want to learn more about trade, and we're able to shape policy from that front so that our community is infused into the larger scheme of things. So, of course, we organize, we facilitate educational programming, of course, we advocate, and of course, we make sure that information and resources are available to our community members. And most importantly, I think from the policy level, we have to make those recommendations of what it is that we see within our community, the needs, the concerns, the complexities, up into government and beyond in order to promote the welfare of the community. I should also mention that we have a 15-seat board, or commission on African Affairs, who's really just responsible for advocating for African community members in D.C. and really bring to our attention kind of cases of neglect and abuse and things that we really can't see, kind of from the office. They're kind of the eyes and ears in the community, and they help us shape our programming based on recurrent kind of themes. So we get our information from a lot of different avenues there. So we have 6 programs. We have a capacity building program where we have a business engagement, development, and support series, which really aims at strengthening the African business community here in the District of Columbia by connecting them to each other, the resources, the information, and the services that they need to thrive right here in D.C. So how we do that actively is by establishing linkages and, of course, facilitating workshops, seminars, and symposiums that provide technical assistance and that cover topics like contracting opportunities, capital assistance, how to become a certified business enterprise to do business with DC government, and other kind of resources pertaining to economic development. One of our kind of big, I would say, one of the programs I was the most pleased with was one that we did around this time last year. It was called From DC to Africa, Growing Local, Going Global. It was a business seminar that actually kind of started a little small, but as we kind of got traction on it, we were like, wait, this is getting a lot bigger, than what we had planned, just based on community interest, based on what I had heard since I had been appointed in January of 2011 was around this specific issue. So fast forward, what ended up happening that day was there were about 250 people that ended up coming and really wanting to kind of experience the full-day seminar. And again, what we did at that seminar was connect district businesses to local and international resources for new opportunities for business and trade in Africa. And we have presenting partners from OPEC, SBA, Import-Export Bank, a few representatives from African embassies. So it really targeted, although we initially targeted the African immigrant community, of course, Friends of Africa and folks that are interested in doing business in Africa came and really just loved it. So it's something that we definitely want to continue and do annually. We also are working from a policy standpoint on the state of African businesses and entrepreneurship in the District of Columbia. It's really a research and public relations project that aims to bring awareness to the contribution of the African immigrant community's businesses in DC that might otherwise kind of fly under the radar because of the lack of data, again, the lack of disaggregated data, lumping the African immigrant community into the black race and presenting it as a monolithic block doesn't really kind of enable us to see what the contributions are from that front. So that's something that we really want to work on to make sure that we're educating the larger community on what the African business community is really contributing in DC. We have a nonprofit engagement development and support series. I won't really go into it, but we do a lot of strategic planning with African-led community-based organizations who work to improve the outcomes of our most vulnerable constituents. We've hosted strategic planning sessions with over probably about 10 or 12 of them in the last fiscal year. And we're constantly connecting our nonprofits to different resources around grants, which is particularly what they're looking for, so that they can definitely scale and then turn around and provide our community members with the kind of information that they would need. We have a thriving internship and volunteer program, which is our second program. And I'll just mention that we're actually currently hosting, in partnership with Atlas Corps, their Sudan program, a fellow from Sudan. So what happened was the State Department funded Atlas Corps to really do kind of a concerted, develop a concerted kind of program around recruiting Sudan professionals, nonprofit professionals from the country of Sudan and placing them here in different organizations right here in DC. So our fellow is wonderful. His name is Sharif. He went to the University of Khartoum in Sudan, studied minor surgery and medicine, and is fluent in Arabic, so definitely contributes to our capacity within the office. And then, from our standpoint, it's just kind of our little way of, really teaching around what strengthening democratic institutions, building coalitions for them to actually be able to take that information after his year-long fellowship and go back to Sudan and hopefully be able to scale those things up on the ground. So that's important for us around our intern and volunteer piece. Our outreach and education program is our third one, which is a catch-all. So it's our health piece, it's our education, it's our public safety, and it's our civic engagement and public participation, which is extremely important. The last two is our Multicultural Awareness and Development Program that really aims to celebrate the district's multiculturalism and diversity. It's where our festival falls. I don't know how many of you guys have come into our festival that we've had. We had the third one last year. And by the way, the mayor actually proclaimed September as African Heritage Month in the District of Columbia last year for the first time ever. So that's kind of where that program falls. It's always a wonderful platform for us to raise awareness around the diversity within our community in DC, some of the intricacies and needs of our community members, and it just gives us a stage to be able to present that to the wider community. And of course, discussions fall under that as well. And lastly, our youth program. We're always in our schools, DC public schools, charter schools, engaging our youth and really promoting leadership and civic engagement. We want them to be on youth councils within district government. We want them to testify for specific kind of policy issues within education, within DC public schools or charter schools that affect them, and ensure that they're kind of aware of that process early on, which I think is extremely important. So I mentioned early on, we've done focus groups at different schools. We've hosted about 100 African youth with the mayor's town hall, where they were able to directly engage him. I think the mayor was extremely enlightened by some of the things that the community members had to say. So it's just one of the things that we do in that program to make sure that our youth are continuously connected. So I know that was a mouthful. But there are definitely always ways to kind of keep in contact with the office, and maybe I can talk about that a little later.
That would be helpful. So at this time, I would like to open it up for questions from the audience. There is a mic back there, if you could grab it. Thank you. Thanks. All right.
Can I just speak without the mic loudly, or are you recording?
Well, it's being webcasted, so I'll just make sure that it's heard. Thank you.
Okay.
Are we on?
So it was really interesting to hear about how you interface with the federal government and USAID and some of these larger initiatives. And I'm just interested to hear, how does your office work with some of the nonprofit organizations like Lutheran Refugee Services or Catholic Relief that do the refugee and immigration resettlement for a lot of these communities? And also, does the mayor's office engage with, since the community largely lives on the periphery of DC and in Maryland and Virginia, does the mayor's office engage with organizations in Virginia and Maryland to either share knowledge or collaborate on programming?
Thank you. Two very good questions. Do you want to take them?
We'll do one at a time.
Okay, sure.
Oh, is it related? Then go ahead.
So thank you. I wanted to ask, with the current immigration debate, how is your office sensitizing the African community? Because I think part of the issue has been in Congress, Capitol Hill, that you're not hearing a lot of black voices or African voices on the immigration debate. So just kind of to highlight some of the programs that you have around that or activities that you've had.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you. 2 or 3 or 4 very good questions that I think everyone could stand to learn from. So how we actually interface with the refugee organizations. we do have a standing office of refugee resettlement, obviously, within the city through the Department of Health and Human Services. So obviously we work very closely with them, particularly from a data collection standpoint. Again, the data piece, I'm always looking to mine data from wherever I can, so that's always extremely important. But in terms of external refugee resettlement pieces, they definitely act as resources. So we have internal resource guides, and we're currently working on an external one in different languages that we can share with community members. But whenever we get constituent cases that come in that may need specific kind of pointers or help, we're able to kind of liaison them with specific external kind of nonprofits. So our role primarily, chiefly, is around just being a resource center, a first stop, particularly for new African immigrants and more established ones, because we all exist in different buckets, right? But definitely chief would be more kind of liaising them and directing them to specific services within government where they can get that support, or with nonprofits where they can get the support. And you asked about how we interface with Virginia and Maryland. So we do interface with Maryland quite a bit, I would say. VA too. I mean, there are good community-based organizations that are there, like ECDC. I think there's CARA that's out in VA as well. But Maryland, from a government vantage point, there is a advisory committee, Maryland Montgomery County Advisory Committee, and there's also a community liaison, Daniel Korama, who is kind of the equivalent of me, but in Montgomery County. And then he also includes his target audience, or his scope includes African and Caribbean immigrants. But they actually just had a retreat. It's funny that you would mention that, this past Saturday, and we had our commissioners retreat late last year. So they come, they speak at our retreats and our strategic kind of meetings, and we're able to kind of share ideas on how they're able to move specific agendas forward, and kind of priorities within their own jurisdictions, and then see how we can overlap and align. Now, with this year in September, with AU turning 50 this year, there's a huge kind of push around how we can all kind of work together towards one larger kind of awareness program or activity, maybe around a specific issue area, maybe with the celebratory feel as a vehicle, but not as the kind of outcome of the program. But we have been in talks with Montgomery County to do that. And there's also a commission on the governor's level that we've kind of interfaced with in Montgomery County. So definitely lots of information sharing, considering that our community members kind of move in and out. And, they may live in D.C. and work in Maryland, so we're able to kind of capture that from that angle. In terms of the immigration debate, so yes, there has been lots of kind of discussion and discourse around immigration. In fact, late last year, the D.C. Council actually did a sense of council to Congress to pass the DREAM Act. Which was excellent. So the local government obviously is well in support of kind of the immigrant communities in D.C. being super immigrant friendly. They jumped on and were able to kind of organize that. And myself, the Director of Latino Affairs and Director of Asian and Pacific Islander Affairs, testified at the Sense of Council hearing, really just sharing our perspectives on the DREAM Act and how it's affecting each of our individual communities. So definitely support of the city, the mayor, the city council, everyone's working on that together. But yeah, there has been a lack of African immigrants and Black immigrants as a whole, African immigrants in particular, and Black immigrants in general in the entire immigration debate. And so much so that there was actually a rally. I don't know if you were familiar with, did you go? Oh, fantastic. Which I was so pleased to see. I mean, I made sure within the office that we circulated that and shared that internally within government with all our stakeholders. And I think that the coverage from it was so good. I think even the visuals that were given, like by media around, I saw one where, there's an African diaspora is included too, Black people are immigrants too. I think that type of messaging is what's needed because everything in government, and you guys know this, is visual. I mean, it's really about what people see, and if the face of immigration policy is looking, homogenous, then that's what everyone is going to take it as. So I was so happy, to kind of see that rally. I wasn't able to attend, but I think a few folks at the office went in and kind of see, that visual was extremely important, but I'm going off on a tangent. What we've done in the past for DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, was the commission. What happened then is that the vice chair of the commission is an immigration attorney, the vice chair of our commission. So she was able to organize the commissioners and did an educational video on what DACA is and isn't. Because right when that was rolled out, there were these huge issues around, there was just a lot of technical assistance that needed to be provided, but we were finding that there were vacuums within the community because there weren't really people that were providing it directly to African immigrant communities, particularly the Ethiopian community with the language barrier, the Amharic piece. So what we did was we were able to do that kind of PR video and share that at least with the community. So that way we shared it with community members that were able to obviously translate it and share it with their community. So CBOs like the Ethiopian Community Center and ECDC can kind of train based on the information that we were able to give them within that video. And in the past, we've done immigration kind of workshops around specific issues, U-type visas, for victims, immigrants that are victims. Also, we've partnered with MPD to do present information around being able to report anonymously, because underreporting within our community can be an issue because of the mistrust piece. So lots of work around public safety, and definitely right in line with safe communities, which is the mayor's priority. And I think, that was all the questions there.
I think so. Any more questions from our audience? Go ahead. Yeah.
Hello. Thank you so much. I've learned a lot, especially about the African immigrants, where they're located, where there's a high population. With that, you mentioned that there are some groups within the African immigrant population that are significantly large. And they've been able to coalesce and mobilize around issues. When we're talking about lobbying on behalf of their sending countries, for example, I think we kind of touched on that. But if you could speak more from your own experience, or even just getting a sense of how young African immigrants who have either been brought here or have grown up here could possibly lobby on behalf of on issues such as the immigrant status of Africans, on other issues, and how we can maybe mobilize and utilize our skills and our talents to be able to push pro-African agendas forward, knowing that obviously that we are in the U.S. and so there is obviously some pragmatism there.
Thank you. It's a good question. And it gives me an opportunity to kind of give a little bit of background around what the communities in D.C. look like in terms of top sending countries, which I think would give a good kind of picture to you all around in helping understand the question a bit better. But the African immigrant community I mentioned earlier within the larger DMV, or the larger D.C., Maryland, Virginia areas at about 170,000. The number drops to roughly 16,000 where you're just taking into account the African immigrant community in D.C. And the top sending countries in D.C. are number one, Ethiopia. If that's not obvious, you're not in D.C. Second in line is Nigeria. Third is Ghana. Fourth is Cameroon. And the other ones that are rounding out the top 10 are Egypt, Liberia, Somalia, Guinea, Sudan, and Eritrea. Now, if I had the pie chart or the kind of actual presentation that breaks down the percentage, there's this huge piece of the pie that says other, right? Oh, there we go. Did your research. There's this huge piece of the pie that's 34% that says other, right? So we would love to know, how these kind of other folks are classified, what countries they're from, what languages are kind of peaking. But that's just one of the challenges that we're facing, within the office around the lack of disaggregated data. But even just around kind of the diaspora and organizing and what the diaspora is contributing and how they can actually, better be connected, to the issues on the Hill and better kind of lend their voice to specific discussions that shape foreign policy within their countries of origin. I think the best way to kind of speak about that would be to talk about specific kind of U.S. diaspora folks that have launched initiatives back in their home countries that are based here in the U.S. that have really scaled. An example would be Face Africa. I don't know how many of you all are familiar with the Water and Sanitation Project that just had a huge gala in New York City this past weekend. She's doing wonderful work. I believe she's Liberian American. Earlier I spoke about LDI Africa, Benga Ogujemi, who is the CEO. Benga's originally from Nigeria. He resided here in D.C. for a few years, was with Atlas Corps, was a protege of Atlas Corps, and decided to take Atlas Corps' model back to Nigeria and really recruit the global African diaspora to come back and volunteer within the finance sector and also capacity building sector. So kind of a reverse model of what happens with Atlas Corps here in DC. Of course, there's Project Diaspora. We're all familiar with TMS Rouge, who's very kind of outspoken and does wonderful work. He's of East African descent. He's Ugandan, but he's based here. He's really shown the power of kind of social media and organizing around specific issues that affect the diaspora. And I think even around the Coney 2012 piece, I don't know if that was a huge kind of pushback from the East African community, particularly the Ugandan diaspora, around how the Coney 2012 kind of movement was just kind of taken on. It kind of took on another kind of form of its own, but without really actively including the Ugandan voice on the ground around, how they were feeling and what their experiences were from their narrative. Really kind of hijacking the narrative, without, really kind of accounting for the folks that are on the ground. So they're always kind of watchdogs. Oh, and even more recently, Urban Outfitters. I don't know how many of you guys saw what was happening with Urban Outfitters. It was a traditional Abisha Ethiopian garment that was essentially kind of taken and marketed as a 90s kind of wear, a grunge type of wear, when in actuality it was traditional kind of Abisha Ethiopian garb. So the East African community pushed back. And it was huge. It wasn't just East Africa. Everybody kind of joined in. The joke was, do they think Africans don't have internet? Or what the issue is? That there was a lot of different, very cheeky kind of comments that I read that were being made that were really funny. But it just goes to show that the diaspora is really watching. They're aware. They're organizing the African diaspora, and they're really kind of putting their money where their mouth is. They aren't just kind of talking about it, as they call it, like couch chair politics. They're really kind of actively involved in keeping their eye on things that just don't quite sit right, and really being able to kind of call those specific things out. But from a policy front and on the Hill, there are institutions even within Congress, for instance, the Congressional African Staffers Association. I know Moon is doing wonderful work there. And there's also an Ethiopian caucus in Congress as well that's doing kind of wonderful work in recruiting. So there are many ways to stay plugged in. I think it's just about being plugged into the right channels. The Office on African Affairs, plug, and just really kind of being aware of ways in which you can actively engage and lend your voice, particularly given the proximity that we have to power and, resources and, White House and Congress right at our backyard. It just makes it that much easy.
Are there any last questions? Take one more if we have any.
I had a question myself.
All right.
Thanks. Your talk has been really comprehensive. So my question is more from personal experience. I've interacted with some immigrants, and a lot of them are really highly skilled. You touched on this a bit earlier. But then they come here and they are underemployed. Is there anything that you're doing to help people in that sort of situation? I understand there is a large unemployment problem anyway, but is there anything that your office is doing to probably help these highly skilled people probably get jobs that match their skills?
It's an excellent question. And I have to start by even kind of making sure that I kind of inform you guys on what the mayor is doing. I think he's doing wonderful work around really pushing the workforce development and jobs agenda. Unemployment rate in DC is down since he's been in office. When he came in, it was at 11.4, 11.2. We're currently at 8.4. So there are definitely kind of strides that are being made from that front. What we were able to do with one of the mayor's initiatives called One City, One Hire, I'm not quite sure how many of you guys are familiar with that. It's the employer-driven kind of hiring initiative with the goal of really putting residents back to work. So what we were able to do to actually support that initiative was partner with the Department of Employment Services to recruit African businesses right here in D.C. as private sector hiring partners. So this initiative was basically recruiting businesses that were willing to pledge to hire district residents. So it's been a wonderfully kind of successful initiative, and I should mention that that's something that we'd actually worked on. But really internally, and this would fall in our outreach and education program, this year we actually launched our Job Circle piece, which is kind of this recurring bi-weekly kind of outreach and education effort that we do. We basically reach out to community members within our networks that are looking for jobs that may or may not be high skilled, bring them in a room, and we're able to get specific resources from the DC Department of Health and Human Services, or the DC Department of Human Resources, and kind of other external nonprofits that are on board to support kind of employment efforts, and also just teaching basic specific skills around kind of interviewing and resume tweaking, and really just being able to kind of fine-tune specific things that would help them kind of get placement. And in our minds, particularly in my mind, something I'm extremely kind of passionate about is as we continue to do these circles, we've had 8 so far. I would like to be able to glean kind of the high-skilled African immigrants from those circles that we're having, and then be able to kind of put teeth into a high-skilled African immigrant worker placement program. So, for instance, if you have a doctor from Ethiopia or from Nigeria, instead of them kind of working more of a low-skilled job, perhaps they could teach, within a university at, CCDC or UDC, plug. But, it would be kind of important for them to just be able to kind of align their skills and their expertise with specific job opportunities here that are a bit more fulfilling for them. And then even economics, there's been a number of studies that talks about kind of the negative economic impact of brain waste, on both fronts. I mean, you have to understand how much does it even take to train a doctor in Nigeria, and then, you train them, they leave. They come here, they're driving a cab. It's not that they're not able to practice. We need the service industry. We need those people to push us forward, don't get me wrong. But what happens is that, you lose that tax base. If you look at it from a purely kind of, fiendishly economic standpoint, you're not, this person that could be a practicing doctor who could be taxing more really is not. And then, of course, you're losing that kind of brain or intellectual capital. So, it's our goal really long-term for us to be able to glean from the kind of population that we're targeting, the folks that are really participating in our job circles, getting the skills, seeing who's the best of the best within those job circles, and then just starting with an initial cohort. And then maybe we can get specific kind of support on the local and the federal level, particularly given kind of all the discourse around immigration policy, the high-skilled piece. I'm sure there'll be tons of people that should be excited to jump on. And kind of seeing how we can make that more of a kind of standing or solid program that we can move forward with.
Thank you very much. If there are no more questions, looking, no? Okay. Well, if there are no more questions, I would like to take this opportunity to thank Director Nmezi very much for your time and for a very comprehensive presentation. Thank you.
And thank you all so much. Thank you for having me. This has been wonderful. I love an engaged audience, so excellent. So thank you all so much.